This is your PowerPoint for the PowerPoint quiz in the 1970s. The 1970s has often been called the era of limits. And this is because there was a huge change that took place from what had been the 1945 until the 1975s, which was sort of known as the golden age of the Americas. The golden age of the American economy at that time period, one of the biggest reasons why it was like this, was because after World War II, Europe and Southeast Asia had been so devastated that it really couldn't compete with the United States. Our only biggest competitor at that time period was the Soviet Union. While the Soviet Union was a competitor, it really didn't compete at the same level throughout any of that time period. Once we hit the 1970s, though, there were severe problems that the United States faced, both economically and culturally, and so this becomes known as the era of the limits, in which Keynesianism and the government expansion and economic expansion of the 1950s and 1960s started to slow down and had significant problems. So the 1970s is sort of seen as this transitionary era in which there are a lot of limitations that people are facing, and it's really unclear on where the nation is going. So these economic problems that we were talking about, from 1945 to 1970 was this area that was known as the golden age of the American economy, and it was seen as an area of Keynesianism. At that time period, everybody pretty much adopted Keynesianism within the mainstream. In fact, Richard Nixon, the conservative president at that time period, at one point said that we are all Keynesians now. Now, this is not entirely accurate. There was an underground movement of the new right or new conservatives who would criticize Keynesianism throughout this time period, but they really hadn't provided a dominating narrative or story yet. We're going to see that arise with Ronald Reagan in 1980. In 1970, though, a new problem arose that had economists completely baffled, and it's called stagflation. The idea of stagflation is this: it is inflation combined with a declining employment. Like I said, this baffled economists, and here's why. Economists have always said if you think of the economy, it's sort of like a balancing beam. If you have high unemployment, people don't have a lot of money. So at that point, they're not spending on things, inflation will go down. If, on the other hand, you have high employment, people have a lot of money, they will spend on things, inflation will go up. That usually made the economy pretty easily manageable. If you have inflation, you just take money out of the economy. If you don't have inflation, if you have unemployment, you put money back into the economy. But what happens when you have both of these problems happening at the exact same time? Inflation occurs while at the same time you have unemployment taking place. Economists could not figure it out. The presidents at the time tried to solve the problem. For example, Richard Nixon tried to solve it through price controls to keep inflation down, and he ended the United States' tie to the gold standard on an international basis. Within the United States, after the Bretton Woods Conference, the United States was allowed within the U.S. economy not to tie the dollar to the gold standard. They were allowed to increase the amount of money that was being put into the domestic economy. But internationally, the dollar was tied to the gold standard, and that provided sort of a basis for all of the currencies throughout the world. Nixon decided to cut ties between the U.S. Dollar and the gold standard in order to pump more money into the economy and basically export then our inflation across the board over to Europe. Gerald Ford tried to solve the problems of stagflation with a program called WIN. WIN was Whip Inflation Now. The basic idea of that was he encouraged people voluntarily to reduce their consumer spending in order to try to lower inflation. Between these two presidents, neither one of these programs worked. Nixon's program about price controls worked initially, but once the price controls were raised, inflation just jumped up, and it actually jumped up to a more extreme level, which kind of demonstrated that companies under price controls would lower their standards overall for prices, but once you raise that, they would actually double their amount of prices just because they wanted to make up for the past loss of revenue that they had had. Ford's program of doing things really didn't work. Trying to put voluntary reductions upon people to reduce their spending doesn't make much sense if you want to have a growing economy. The energy crisis. On top of the problems with stagflation, the U.S. also faced a major international crisis when it came to oil and fossil fuels. During 1968, there had been a 7 days war, which really was a one-day war, in which Israel did a preemptive strike on Egypt. The reason why Israel did this was because the Egyptian leader, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had cut off a major trade route leading from the Persian Gulf up into Israel. Gamal Abdel Nasser himself had actually done this not because he was intending to attack Israel, but because he had been lied to. The Soviet Union had told him that Israel was about to invade, and Gamal Abdel Nasser went to his people and said that he would defend his people against the Israeli invasion. Then he found out later that day as he flew over the Israeli border that there was no Israeli invasion that was taking place. At that point, Nasser had a huge problem. If he went in front of his public and told them that he had been lied to, they would have seen him as a weak leader. At the same time, he knew if he went directly straight up against Israel, he took a risk of going up against one of the strongest armies in the world. So instead, he decided to try to bluff the situation. He closed down the Straits of Tiran. That was the area that led from the Persian Gulf up to Israel. And he hoped that over time this would just show a force of strength. Of course, Israel thought that Egypt was really trying to invade, and so they decided to do a preemptive airstrike. They knocked out the entire Egyptian Air Force, and for the next 6 days just mopped up the Egyptian army. The Egyptians at that point got rid of Gamal Abdel Nasser and replaced him with Sadat. Sadat, who was the next president of Egypt, he also tried to invade Israel, and he did it in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. That's one of Israel's highest holy days, and most of their army is at home at that point. At first, Sadat was winning the war, but once the Israeli armies got back together and reattacked, the war was over. Egypt not only lost the war, they lost major territory in the war. At that point, Arab countries realized that militarily, they seemed to have no opportunity to really make any gains against Israel. Israel just had too strong of an army, and because of their Jewish heritage and because of the Holocaust, there was a very strong sense of nationalism in Israel to make sure that Israel would be protected against these attacks from the Arab countries. So Arab countries turned towards another possibility of how to deal with things if they couldn't do it through the military, and that was through international oil sales. They formed an organization called OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and they used that cartel, basically, to reduce oil sales. The way they would do that is that they would put pressure on the West by not producing oil, and that would start to drive up prices. Less oil on the market, huge demand, prices go up. This led to massive oil rationing and inflationary spikes and increases in the West. Deindustrialization. Well, on top of all of these problems that the American economy was facing, there was another problem that was going on over time as countries started to compete against each other. We're still going through this today. It's called deindustrialization. The idea of deindustrialization is a shift in the American economy away from what we had been doing from 1945 to 1970 that made our economy so strong, and that was producing major heavy goods that you could sell on the marketplace for a ton of money. These included things like automobiles and airplanes. Americans have moved away from that economy now to service jobs in finance, real estate, and tourism. There are a lot of these jobs available, but the problem is these jobs just don't pay that much in relation to increasing prices. So this led to a decline in what's known as the real wage. So what is a real wage? Real wages means this. People are paid a certain amount of money for their wages, but if wages don't keep up with the rate of inflation, then they lose their real power. In other words, they can't consume things. What happened from 1970 up until today is that we started to see a decline in this. Even though Americans were paid more, they were not paid enough to keep up with inflation. So what was happening was companies were trying to control for their overall costs. And the way they did this was to outsource their branches, especially to Asian countries, in order to find cheaper labor. At the same time, American companies were also facing increasing global competition, especially from Japan and Germany. For example, the American share of production declined from 32% in the world to 18% in the world. What this was demonstrating was that as European and Southeast Asian countries began to compete more and more on a global basis, companies were then forced to look for cheaper ways to control their costs. Okay, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Everybody likes to be able to go to stores, for example, like Walmart, to go to a store and be able to buy something at a cheap price. But here's the problem. In order to keep those prices cheap, you have to also reduce overall wages. Now you might think, well, but that's a good thing, right? I mean, if prices go down, wages go down, the two things are matched together. But keep in mind, we're not just talking about going out and buying just luxury goods or going out and buying even goods we need like bread. We're talking here about being able to afford things like healthcare, afford things like housing, afford things like education. All of those things have continued to go up in price, which makes it very hard on the American consumer. George Wallace. So in 1968, There was a man who ran for office as a Democrat, but then turned into an independent. So he comes out of the Democratic Party, but he runs as an independent. He eventually forms the American Independent Party. He used to be the governor of Alabama, and he ran on a platform of segregation in the 1950s. He chose to run in 1968 as a third possible candidate. Wallace argued at the time that minorities were threatening the lower and working class white people. In fact, at one point, he went up to New York and in Times Square gave a huge speech in which he had thousands of people come out to watch him, some in protest, but many came out to support him because they believed at the time that minorities were threatening white people's status within the country. Now, notice here that George Wallace represents that southern section of the Democratic Party. And that southern section of the Democratic Party had at one time stood for segregation. Now they knew that that was being lost. Segregation was over, but now they were fearing that minorities were causing chaos and disorder in the streets through riots and through crime and so forth. And so because of that, they saw their own position in society as losing status over time. A lot of these people were those hard hat people that we've talked about before who feared traditional America was kind of going out. Now, this is where you get a lot of controversy over this. Was this about race or was this about like traditional religious beliefs? Wallace played on the racial fears, but you can definitely make a good argument that there were also traditional religious beliefs that people feared were being lost at this time period. The Democratic Party themselves had fractured. Lyndon Johnson had decided not to run for office in 1968 due to the Tet Offensive and problems within the Vietnam War. So at that point, the Democrats fractured into Hubert Humphrey, the vice president, Robert Kennedy, and Eugene McCarthy. Overall, Kennedy and McCarthy believed in getting out of Vietnam as soon as possible. Humphrey believed in a slow de-escalation over time. The Republicans chose to run Richard Nixon. Nixon had run back in 1960 against John F. Kennedy, and he had lost in a very close election. We now know that part of the reason why he lost was Kennedy's ability to use the television in order to appeal to people during the televised debates between Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy. In fact, during those debates, Richard Nixon, if you actually listen to different polls, Richard Nixon won the debate if you were listening in the car on the radio. He lost the debate if you were watching on TV. Well, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that Richard Nixon's message that he was giving, the substance of the message, appealed to most people. But his presentation of that message appealed to very few people. And a big part of that was John F. Kennedy understood the way television worked. Richard Nixon was sweating that night. He was sick. So he was sweating. He didn't look in the camera. He looked at John F. Kennedy, and he tended to pause and kind of go back and forth in his ideas. John F. Kennedy, on the other hand, looked straight into the camera. He was very well poised, and he gave clear and concise points. This appealed to a lot of people through presentation. When this was all done, Richard Nixon was so frustrated and dissatisfied with what had happened that he decided that he told the nation he would never run again. Now, the truth is, on top of that, there was also a good deal of corruption at that time. One of John F. Kennedy and Democrats' biggest allies was within the city of Chicago, a man named Mayor Richard Daley. And Daley actually fixed the election in Chicago to make sure that John F. Kennedy would win there. And it was a huge way for him to win because Richard Nixon only lost by about 200,000 votes nationally. Anyways, Nixon decided that he was going to run again. He did so in 1968, but he feared George Wallace. Now, why would that be the case? Wallace was a Democrat, right? And he was running as an independent, but he'd come out of the Democratic Party, so what would this have anything to do with Richard Nixon? Well, at this point, Nixon was able to appeal to people, especially in the Midwest and in the South. And he feared that Wallace was going to steal away Republican votes in the South. And this would allow Humphrey to eventually win the election, not because he had the most amount of votes, but he had what would be called a plurality of votes, meaning that between Richard Nixon, Humphrey, and George Wallace, the vote would be split between Nixon and Wallace because of the Republicans' dependence upon the South at this time period, and that would allow Humphrey to win. So that was the big fear that Richard Nixon had. Didn't come to pass. Richard Nixon did win in 1968, and he won pretty handily, but that was the fear that he had. So Nixon's agenda. So when Nixon got into his first term of office, Nixon was considered to be a conservative, but in many ways he doesn't look like a conservative, at least not a conservative of today. For example, Nixon promoted a democratic idea at the time by a man named Daniel Patrick Moynihan, and his idea was known as the Family Action Plan. So Daniel Patrick Moynihan wrote this very famous report back in 1956, in which he noticed that there was a problem of a rising single-parent family problem within the African American community, and he feared dependence upon government, especially upon welfare. So Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, okay, here's how we're going to solve this problem. People in poverty need help, but we don't want them dependent on welfare. So he suggested that for people in poverty, they be given an annual wage that would be tied to work requirements. The annual wage would not go up with inflation, so it would stay at a very specific point. You'd have to go to work in order to get it. And Nixon liked the idea because this would mean that it would decrease the overall government spending over time since it wasn't tied to inflation, and it would be tied into work requirements. Nixon also helped to create the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA. The EPA provides rules and regulations to make sure that pollution and other problems in the environment won't take place. However, keep in mind, Nixon's a conservative. The Environmental Protection Agency is a huge agency to put rules across the entire nation on businesses, and it does so from a centralized point. This would appear for a conservative to go against states' rights. Nixon also promoted the Philadelphia Plan for quotas on racial hiring. So notice that Nixon was one of the first individuals to try to put into place affirmative action. And on top of all of this, Nixon, who had a reputation of being an anti-communist crusader, went in and opened up China after he visited Mao Zedong in 1972. So one of our big things that we're going to figure out this week is, what was Nixon up to? If he was a conservative, why was he promoting things that do not appear to be conservative? Here he has an annual wage that's almost like a welfare plan, sets up a huge governmental bureaucracy that seems to violate states' rights, promotes affirmative action, and then on top of all that, he goes and he visits China and opens up trade to a communist country. The Southern Strategy. However, most of this did not take place. Most of the stuff we talked about in the previous slide. And I know this is one of the questions I always get every year. Why is it that Republicans of today sound a lot like Democrats of the 1850s, and Democrats of today sound a lot like the Republicans under Abraham Lincoln? Now, I'm not talking here about the slavery issues, but I'm talking about here about the stress on states' rights versus a strong centralized government. Where do we see this change take place? And I would argue it's right here in what's called the Southern Strategy. So remember what I said about how Nixon feared losing the South to George Wallace. And in 1968, that really was not a problem. Ended up, Nixon handily won that election. But in 1972, Nixon feared that George Wallace was going to gain enough support that this might actually become a reality. He might actually lose because George Wallace would end up splitting the vote. Even though Wallace is a Democrat, he's running as an independent. He would split the South, and that would make it hard for Nixon to be able to win. So Nixon actually met with a man named Strom Thurmond, who used to be a Democrat. He then left the Democratic Party and formed a group called the Dixiecrats. Strom Thurmond believes strongly in segregation. Nixon met backdoor with Strom Thurmond, and he made a deal with him. His deal was this. His deal was that he would play up on racially coded language to rile up the fear of white Southerners, especially on issues of busing. Now, what do I mean by busing? Busing was an idea at this time period to start integration within the cities, where you would bus African American and white kids across the city so that they would be in similar schools. Because remember, at this time period, people were segregated not even by law, but just by economics and by geography. So the idea was to integrate them by busing them across the schools to do this. Nixon promised that he would go around the country and kind of use that issue as a way to kind of like bring up racial fears, and he made that deal with Strom Thurmond behind closed doors. Now, the irony of this was that at the time, Nixon was running against George McGovern from South Dakota. George McGovern at that time period was about as liberal as you're going to get within the American political system at this time period. In fact, as you're going to find out in just a minute, George McGovern never had a chance in winning the election in 1972. But Nixon was very paranoid about this. He thought for sure that Wallace would split the vote. One of the reasons why this didn't happen was that in 1972, George Wallace went to one of his campaign rallies, and as he was there, a man tried to assassinate him, shot him, and was successful in shooting him, was not successful in killing him. George Wallace survived that and continued to live on until the 1980s. To be fair to George Wallace, Wallace did eventually apologize for his segregationist viewpoints in the 1980s. But George Wallace, at this point, because he was shot, decided to step out of the election. At that point, Nixon was able to win the election against George McGovern, but he did implement this Southern strategy in the Republican Party of using these racially coded fears in order to get people to join up in the Republican Party. Watergate scandal. So in 1972, in the election, Nixon beat George McGovern by a landslide. McGovern didn't even come close. He only won the state of Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. And anybody who knows politics knows that Massachusetts is probably the most liberal state in the country next to California. So it's not too surprising that George McGovern won there, but everywhere else, Nixon won. Part of the reason why, as we talked about before, was that George Wallace had been shot. That removed him as a political threat in the South. Nixon easily won this election. Yet after the election, a strange thing happened. Two reporters named Woodward and Bernstein revealed a story about a burglary that took place in the Watergate Hotel before the election. So what were the issues involved? Woodward and Bernstein claimed that they had a source called Deep Throat, and they didn't reveal who Deep Throat was, although we now know Deep Throat actually was an FBI agent at the time. He recently died just about 2-3 years ago, and he came out about 10 years ago as being the source, this Deep Throat source. Deep Throat revealed that the Watergate scandal included Nixon operatives going all the way up to the top, including G. Gordon Liddy and E. Howard Hunt. The House of Representatives took this story and they established a committee to research the issue, and they discovered that the Nixon operatives had been acting in a secret group called the Plumbers. And this group of plumbers had been going after Nixon opponents. For example, they used IRS files to intimidate opponents. They wiretapped phones. Probably one of the most famous cases that they did was to go after the guy Daniel Ellsberg, who had come up with the Pentagon Papers. They actually found out he had been seeing a psychiatrist, so they broke into the office of the psychiatrist and stole the files from the psychiatrist in order to put that information out there to try to discredit Daniel Ellsberg. Obstruction of justice. Well, in order to do this, Nixon did something that has become sort of commonplace now amongst presidents. Bill Clinton did this in his scandal as well. Nixon hired a special prosecutor, a man named Archibald Cox. Cox was actually a Republican himself. He was known for being a moderate. He was known for being extremely good at his job. And Cox's job was to go out and investigate Nixon. And so he went out and did this. And at one point he found out that Nixon had been taping himself in the Oval Office. Now, that might sound kind of strange, but actually this was pretty normal for modern presidents. Everybody since John F. Kennedy has taped themselves in the Oval Office. So Archibald Cox subpoenaed the White House tapes. When he did that, Nixon claimed executive privilege, that he had, while he was in office, he did not need to turn over these tapes. But the Supreme Court ruled against Nixon. They said that he had to send over the tapes, and so he did. But then at that point, he turned around on a Saturday night and he fired Archibald Cox and his entire staff in what has become known as the Saturday Night Massacre. Now, anybody who knows politics knows that when a president fires people on a Friday or a Saturday, that's done intentionally. And the reason why is that an entire weekend goes by and their hope is by Monday the news will have moved on to some other big issue, and that this won't be as big of an issue for the public. Nixon, however, made a drastically bad decision in this case. This became a huge story that he fired his own special prosecutor and staff, and the story stuck with him. Then on top of that, at the same time, they found out that there were 18 minutes missing on the tapes in the Oval Office. Okay, where did these 18 minutes go? Well, Nixon claimed that the reason why the 18 minutes were missing was because he had a foul mouth, which actually was kind of true. We actually know that from tapes from his Oval Office. And he claimed that he had said so many bad words in 18 minutes that he didn't want the American public to be subjected to this and to have the office of the president go down. So that was his explanation for this. Eventually, as they went through more and more of these tapes, they discovered that Nixon had actually told the FBI to slow the investigation down. So this led up to the consequences of Watergate. The Republicans themselves at this point approached Nixon and they demanded of him that he resign, which he did in 1974. His vice president, Gerald Ford, became president and 1 year later pardoned Nixon. Now, from what we know about Gerald Ford's claim on this was that he did this to heal the nation and not have this problem continuing cause a constitutional crisis. Probably true. Gerald Ford ended up being an incredibly honest and man of integrity, but Gerald Ford and the man after him, Jimmy Carter, were seen at this time period as incompetent, and they were seen as possibly a part of this huge scandal. When Gerald Ford did this, He was really viewed at the time as having just protecting his fellow Republican. This did allow for liberal Democrats to sweep into the House in 1974, and there was a belief that liberals would now regain their spot that they had lost during the Nixon era. Actually, it's probably quite the opposite. There was a group of Republicans called the Watergate Babies, and these Watergate Babies were Republicans who were pushed farther to the right and made the argument that Watergate only showed that government was corrupt, and this is why we need a smaller government. Now, these were all Republicans, but they were making the argument that whether it's Democrats or Republicans, we see the same problem over and over again. We need to limit the size of government. So actually, in many ways, the Watergate scandal that a lot of people thought at the time were going to revive the liberal movement probably did just the opposite, probably really created a stronger conservative movement with a lot of suspicion towards government. Jimmy Carter. So after Gerald Ford, the Democrats put up a man named Jimmy Carter, who is the Georgian governor and Georgian farmer, in 1976. Carter was an evangelical, so that was symbolizing the rise of religious movements. Carter easily won against Gerald Ford, and when he became president, he actually was pretty economically moderate to conservative. Now, not conservative in the way that we think of today, but he pursued certain conservative policies like deregulation of banks and the airplane industry. But stagflation only increased throughout the 1970s, and by the end of the 1970s, unemployment and inflation were high. In fact, unemployment stood at about 10%, inflation was about 8 to 9% by the end of the decade. Iran. On top of this, Jimmy Carter faced massive foreign policy issues. For example, America at the time had supported Shah Pahlavi since removing Mohammad Mossadegh from power back in the 1950s. In the 1970s, there was a coalition of people in Iran, liberals, Marxists, and Islamists, who organized against Pahlavi. Eventually, the Islamists, who were led by a man named Ayatollah Khomeini, organized in order to help in this revolution, but then they turned against their fellow revolutionaries, the liberals and Marxists, and imprisoned or killed them. And Khomeini used this as a way to turn Iran into a radical Shiite Muslim state. Then in 1979, a bunch of Iranian students went into the American embassy, and they took 55 American hostages and held them for 444 days. Carter responded. He had a plan to deal with this, and the plan was to have American helicopters fly over the Saudi Arabian desert, land on top of the embassy, go in and rescue the people there, and then to fly them back out to the Persian Gulf where there would be American aircraft carriers ready to get them. Unfortunately, the helicopters got stuck in the Saudi Arabian desert during a sandstorm, and by the next day, all of these helicopters had crashed to the ground, making the U.S. look, at the time, what was called as a paper tiger, meaning we looked strong on paper, but when we actually had to do anything, and especially in contrast to a country like Iran, we would fail. The civil rights movement. So there were a number of changes that took place at this time period socially. For example, the civil rights movement, one of the biggest issues was affirmative action, which was represented in a famous Supreme Court case called Bakke versus UC Regents of California. UC Davis had put aside 16 positions out of 100 for a medical program, and a white man named Alan Bakke applied for a position. He was not able to make it into the first 84 positions, but he would have been within those 16 positions that were after the first 84. He wasn't accepted, though, because he was not of African American descent. So he claimed that this was reverse racism, since he could not apply in the pool of 16. The argument on the opposite side was that in order to try to increase diversity and also really to solve for problems of the past as far as racism goes, there needed to be set aside some amount of positions to make sure that African Americans would be in the pool. The court, in the end, decided against quotas, meaning that this pool of 16 was unfair. But they allowed for colleges to take race into consideration, meaning that when they sat down into their complete profile, they could look at the issue of race and ask whether or not there was enough diversity and whether or not an applicant who was coming into colleges had enough of obstacles and challenges in their past that should be taken into consideration. So this has remained with us as a big question about whether or not affirmative action can be mended or if it should be gotten rid of altogether. Feminism. In 1973, there was another important Supreme Court case for feminists, and that was Roe v. Wade. The case dealt with a woman, Roe, from Texas, who wanted to have an abortion but was not allowed to because the Texas law did not allow for any abortions, even in the case of women's health. The court ended up splitting birth into 3 trimesters, making the claim that in the first trimester, first 3 months, a woman had the choice to have an abortion. That would be legal. In the second 3 months, they had the choice, but they had to do so with doctor's consultation. And in the third trimester, last 3 months, a woman could only do this in the case of a woman's health. This eventually led to a massive religious backlash known as the pro-life movement, which included both conservative evangelicals and Catholics, which actually was strange for that time period. Today it's not so strange, but back at that time period, conservative evangelicals and Catholics had always had a very contentious relationship from the past over issues of immigration and papal issues and so forth. But on this particular issue, they were able to unite, and ever since then have had a strong unity on traditional ethics when it comes to the beginning of human life. Gay rights. In Dade County in Florida in the 1970s, there was a law that was passed protecting gay rights. But an evangelical woman named Anita Bryant led a movement against this and eventually was able to repeal the ordinance. In San Francisco, in response to this, there was a man named Harvey Milk. Milk had come out of the closet during his 40s. He ran for county supervisor there and eventually passed a very similar law as the one in Dade County. And this became a huge victory for people in the gay rights community, especially in San Francisco. But then in 1978, he was assassinated along with the mayor there, Mayor Moscone, in 1978. He wasn't assassinated for being gay. There had been a worker in the office who had been fired who came back and was upset at the mayor and ended up shooting a number of people. Milk and Moscone were two of the people killed in that assassination. Another huge social change that was happening was with the Supreme Court. Richard Nixon had appointed a conservative court justice, Warren Burger, to replace the previous court justice, Warren, who had been very liberal. Burger was conservative, but just like with Warren, when he ended up being on the court, he was moderate to liberal. For example, in 1972, he led a case that passed Furman v. Georgia that ended the death penalty. Now, granted, in 1976, they reinstated the death penalty with Gregg versus Georgia, but there were a number of cases where the court ended up being far more liberal than what Nixon had thought they would be. One of the conservative elements that remained with the court all the way up until about 2003 was a case called Bowers v. Hardwick. And in that case, the court upheld laws at the state level against sodomy and homosexuality as being deviant. That would eventually be overturned in 2003, but that was upheld throughout the 1970s and 1980s. Which brings up the big cultural fight that's been taking place, and that is over conservative religious movements. In the 1950s, Billy Graham led a nationwide revival, along with conservative Catholic priest Fulton Sheen. And this eventually opened up the doors to evangelical movements that argued in the past that they should not get involved in public affairs, but now argued that it was necessary that they do so due to the secularization of American culture. This changed especially with the evangelical televangelist Jerry Falwell, who argued that American secularization was the problem. He formed what was called the moral majority, which believed that the majority of Americans held to traditional values on sex, gender roles, church, and family. And the reason why this is so important is because of the changes that were taking place in the family that remain so today. So from the 1970s up until today, we have seen real wages decline. And because of that, women have been entering into the workforce at a much stronger percentage in order to make sure that families have enough money to keep going. So we see in 1950, women in the workforce made up about 37% of women were in the workforce. By 1990, it was up to 78%. Also, there was a change at the time in sexual expectations within the family. There was more of an acceptance of divorce, single parents, a variety of different types of families, and sex was seen as something more of a statement of pleasure and individual happiness, not as something about obligation and reproduction.